So clearly a lot happened today. We're going to get into all of it over the next hour. But I want to start 11 years ago this month, after Ukraine's parliament voted unanimously to remove the country's pro-Russian president from office. Vladimir Putin's forces invaded eastern Ukraine with a force known at the time as the Little Green Men, and claimed that part of Ukraine was actually a part of Russia. You probably remember it, and I remember it well because I was the spokesperson at the State Department at the time. I also remember well Republicans being quite united in their opposition to Putin's aggression and vocal about it. They were also pretty united in their anger they felt and vocalized toward Democratic President Obama for doing what they felt was not enough to help the Ukrainians. And one of the Republican senators who stood up at that time to make the case very passionately to Americans about why they should care enough about aid to Ukrainians to have it delivered was someone you may recognize.
And we should always stand on the side of the vulnerable and the oppressed. Vladimir Putin's recent invasion of Ukraine is a clear challenge to these principles. Some ask, why is this our problem? Well, because we cannot allow the precedent to be set that in order to engage the West in trade and commerce, smaller nations must first seek the permission of their more powerful neighbors. President Obama talks tough about Vladimir Putin, but his actions have not gone far enough to change Putin's calculation that the benefits of his aggression outweigh the costs.
And then, a few years later, when Senator Rubio had concerns that Donald Trump's first choice for Secretary of State wasn't sufficiently outraged at Vladimir Putin's behavior, he let him have it too.
Mr. Tillerson, do you believe that Vladimir Putin and his cronies are responsible for ordering the murder of countless dissidents, journalists, and political opponents?
I do not have sufficient information to make that claim.
Are you aware that people who oppose Vladimir Putin wind up dead all over the world, poisoned, shot in the back of the head? And do you think that was coincidental, or do you think that it is quite possible, or likely, as I believe, that they were part of an effort to murder his political opponents?
That was then, not that long ago. Senator Marco Rubio laying out the stakes pretty perfectly, I will hand it to him. Americans stand up for the oppressed, not the oppressor. We don't reward the aggression of violent thugs like Putin. Of course we don't. We raise the cost of that aggression, or we should. If there was one running theme, actually, to Rubio's career in the Senate, other than his desire for career advancement, it was his concern about Russia and Putin, who he called a criminal, a murderer, and an authoritarian thug who must be stopped. But then Donald Trump became president again, and he made Rubio the Secretary of State. And as a result, on Tuesday, Rubio, the former Russia hawk, was sent to Saudi Arabia to do Trump's bidding, sitting across from Russia's foreign minister, after, by the way, his boss had already made clear he was more than happy to give Putin all the Ukrainian land they wanted. And Rubio had to try to negotiate an end to Putin's war in Ukraine with Putin, but not with the Ukrainians.
The only leader in the world who can make this happen, who can even bring people together to begin to talk about it in a serious way, is President Trump. He's the only one in the world that can do that right now.
Quite a claim, the only one in the world. But even as Rubio was at that table, Trump was making pretty clear where his allegiances actually were. I mean, he called Ukrainian President Zelensky a dictator without elections, falsely accusing Zelensky of starting the war in which Russia invaded his country. Just wrap your head around that. He claimed Zelensky was suspending elections because his approval rating was only 4%, which, by the way, is so far off. A recent poll showed Zelensky's approval rating was actually at 57%. Zelensky responded by saying that most of Trump's claims are Russian propaganda, adding, quote, "Unfortunately, President Trump is living in this disinformation space," an evergreen statement. But none of this shouldn't come as a big surprise, because all of this, the U.S.-Russia summit, Trump's ranting against Ukraine, all of it really comes just days after Trump had his first phone call back in the White House with none other than Vladimir Putin. Now, Trump did send his Ukraine envoy, retired General Keith Kellogg, to Kyiv to meet with Zelensky today. But then their planned joint news conference after the meeting was abruptly canceled, with basically no clear reasons given at all. So it's clear what Trump's idea for ending this war is. Reward the violent dictator who started it, and demonize the democratically elected president of the country that was invaded. And it bears repeating, when the U.S. faced a similar situation in 2014, after Russia invaded eastern Ukraine, took Crimea for itself, there was a huge caucus in Washington screaming at then President Obama and the entire administration that they needed to provide lethal assistance, weapons to the Ukrainians, and be tougher on Putin. And it was dominated by Republican Russia hawks like Rubio and Senator Lindsey Graham.
If we do not decisively push back against Putin and make him weaker and all of our friends in the region stronger, the Iranians are going to misunderstand yet again we mean it regarding their nuclear program. So much is at stake. Putin's on the wrong side of history. He's on the wrong side of the law. Make him pay a price. The Ukrainian people are dying for their freedom. I hope we will stand with them, not just in words, but in deeds.
I mean, you heard him laid out clearly there. Graham said not helping Ukraine would put the U.S. on the wrong side of history, and it would send the wrong message to adversaries like Iran, which is very different from what he is saying these days.
Talking to the Russians separately, I'm actually okay with that. I think there's one person that Putin really is afraid of, that's Trump. If you ever get a good deal on Ukraine, it'd be because Trump created a sense of dread by Russia.
I mean, what are they dreading exactly? Taking the land Trump has offered them? I'm not totally sure about that analysis. But this is what Republicans are doing now, going against all of their strongest convictions about America's role in the world, about the threat of Russia, the threat of Putin, to bend the knee to Trump. It reached a climax today when National Security Advisor Michael Waltz dodged some pretty straightforward questions from reporters about Trump blaming Zelensky for the war and about Waltz's own past statements to the contrary.
Who does he think is more responsible for the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Putin or Zelensky?
Well, look, his goal, Peter, is to bring this war to an end, period. And there has been ongoing fighting on both sides.
You wrote in an op-ed in the fall of 2023 that, quote, Putin is to blame, certainly like al-Qaeda was to blame for 9/11. Do you still feel that way now, or do you share the president's assessment as he says Ukraine is to blame for the start of this war?
Well, it shouldn't surprise you that I share the president's assessment on all kinds of issues. What I wrote as a member of Congress was as a former member of Congress. Look, what I share the president's assessment on is that the war has to end. This is a president of peace, and who here would argue against peace?
Okay, so you do.
Turns out there's an op-ed for everything. That's how Republicans play the game now. The game of basically, how do I please our dear leader? The problem is, this is not a game at all. I mean, Trump is openly taking the side of a dictator against an oppressed American ally. Millions of Ukrainian lives are at stake, and that's just the beginning. This is having a broader impact on the world. It could have one. It gives Putin a green light to carve out a new empire, and he might decide that includes Poland or Latvia or Estonia, NATO allies that America is still theoretically sworn to protect. But what are those promises worth now? I mean, that's the other question. It's also a bad sign for our domestic politics. It's an indication of just how willing the Republicans are to go against their own long-held and publicly stated political convictions, to back Trump when he's at his most erratic and self-serving. And if they'll bend on this, what else are they going to be willing to bend on? Democratic Senator Chris Coons of Delaware sits on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and he joins me now. Senator Coons, I just wanted to start by asking you, when you hear how Secretary Rubio and Senator Graham are talking about Russia now, given what they've said in the past, what do you make of that?
Look, I think you framed it well, Jen, which is that President Trump is the one who has made a dramatic departure from our previous positions as a country. And by suggesting that Zelensky is responsible for Russia's invasion of Ukraine, by denouncing Zelensky as supposedly an illegitimate dictator, President Trump is completely reversing, standing on its head, the positions that my Republican colleagues have held for years. With the additional announcement this week that Secretary Hegseth is calling for 8% across-the-board cuts to defense spending for the next 5 years, I'll be interested to see how they turn themselves into a pretzel to somehow suggest that that advances peace through strength.
They certainly are becoming good at turning themselves into pretzels. I'll give them that. There seems to be this argument. You have sat at the negotiating table. I have been at the negotiating table. But they are making this argument that if you give Putin the parts of Ukraine he wants and also pull back assistance to Ukraine, that will put Putin in a tougher point of negotiation. That does not make any sense. But explain to us what you make of that argument.
So folks who are working for President Trump, who is allegedly a great deal maker, I think he wrote a book called The Art of the Deal, ought to go look in that book and see if there's anything in there that suggests the best way to negotiate is by giving away your major points right up front. Obviously, this isn't how Trump and Hegseth and Waltz should be negotiating with Putin. Putin is a murderous thug. He's a gangster and a KGB agent, and they all know it. And the only way to achieve a just and lasting peace for Ukraine, worthy of the fierce sacrifice of the many Ukrainians who have fought and died to recover their sovereign territory from Russian aggression, is to stand toe-to-toe with Putin and threaten to increase sanctions on Russia, threaten to send more weapons, not less, to Ukraine, and lock arms with our European partners who have already spent more than we have on Ukraine's defense and economy. If he did that, Trump would show that he understands how to achieve peace through strength. Instead, what he's doing so far is going to lead to chaos through weakness. And if he, in fact, betrays Ukraine, he will be the biggest loser of the 21st century.